On January 1st, 1753, Elizabeth Canning, at the age of 18, resided in Aldermanbury as the daughter of a carpenter. Her mother, a widow struggling with 4 younger children, was known for her poverty, yet esteemed for her impeccable character. Elizabeth, of diminutive stature with a ruddy complexion, suffered from occasional unconsciousness due to a childhood accident when a garret ceiling collapsed on her. Despite the potential association with hysteria, Elizabeth's history of employment contradicted such assumptions. Having served for years under Mr. Wintlebury, a publican, she earned praise for her integrity and reserved demeanor. Transitions to better positions, such as at Mr. Lyon's establishment, validated her reputation for modesty and honesty, corroborated by Lyon and neighbors alike. Clad in her finest attire on New Year's Day 1753, Elizabeth donned a purple masquerade gown, a white handkerchief and apron, a black quilted petticoat, a green undercoat, black shoes, blue stockings, and a white shaving hat adorned with green ribbons. Her rosy complexion complemented her ensemble. Carrying her wages, a golden half-guinea and assorted shillings and coppers in her pocket, she generously shared pennies with her siblings, save for one brother who had offended her. Nevertheless, she later relented, purchasing a mince pie for him before departing for her maternal aunt's residence at Saltpetre Bank. Although she intended to return promptly to accompany her mother in purchasing a cloak, the Colleys detained her with an unexpected late dinner. By 9 p.m., concern had already arisen, prompting Mr. Lyon to inquire at Mrs. Canning's residence. As the evening progressed, the Colleys escorted Elizabeth partway home, but the events thereafter remained shrouded in mystery. Upon Elizabeth's failure to arrive, Mrs. Canning dispatched her servant shortly after 10 o'clock to the Colleys, who were already retired for the night. The ensuing hours were consumed by frantic searches, yet yielded no trace of Elizabeth. By 6 in the morning, renewed inquiries proved futile. Weeks passed with no sign of her whereabouts. In collaboration with neighbors, Mrs. Canning took to the newspapers, publicizing the disappearance and referencing reports of distressing sounds heard near Bishopsgate Street during the early hours of January 2nd. Despite her inclination towards prayer, seeking solace in various churches and Mr. Wesley's chapel, Mrs. Canning also sought counsel from a dubious, wise man. Though his ominous demeanor unnerved her, his advice boiled down to persistent advertisement. Rumors swirled of Elizabeth's captivity by an elderly woman. Skeptics also theorized that the disappearance might have been engineered to evoke sympathy, or Elizabeth had left for reasons typical of youthful indiscretion. Medical examinations failed to corroborate these speculations, deeming them unlikely. Elizabeth's character stood as unblemished as that of La Pucelle. On the evening of January 29th, as the poor women marked it as the eve of King Charles's martyrdom, Mrs. Canning, according to her apprentice, knelt in prayer, fervently longing for even the faintest glimpse of her daughter. At that very moment, a noise resonated from the door. The apprentice, upon opening it, stood transfixed in astonishment. Before them stood Elizabeth Canning, bloodied, hunched, pallid, draped in a tattered dressing jacket and soiled petticoat, with a makeshift bandage around her head. Despite her dire condition, she bestowed upon her mother the only possession she possessed for her estranged little brother, the insignificant farthing. Friends were summoned, including Mrs. Myers, Miss Polly Lyon, daughter of her employer, and others, while curious onlookers such as Robert Scarrett, a laborer unfamiliar with Elizabeth, crowded in. A small amount of wine was prepared, yet the emaciated girl could not consume it, indicating her perilous condition. Without delving into distressing specifics, medical testimony, along with that of a midwife who offered some comfort to Mrs. Canning, unequivocally attested to her proximity to death. The girl recounted her ordeal, but what precisely did she disclose? According to Mr. Austin Dobson's account in the Dictionary of National Biography, her narrative gradually took shape under the questions of sympathizing neighbors, with some affirmation seemingly prompted by leading inquiries from Robert Scarrett. However, the reliability of neighbors' recollections of Elizabeth's statements during her wretched state must be scrutinized as they were recounted during her perjury trial in April-May 1754, likely influenced by friendly bias and the distortion of memory over time. On January 31, 1753, Elizabeth provided her testimony before Alderman Chitty, but discrepancies emerged when compared to the accounts neighbours claimed she gave upon her return home on January 29, 1753, as testified during her trial in 1754. This crucial inconsistency, overlooked by Mr. Paget in his essay on the matter, underscores the complexity of the case. Complicating matters further, by 1754, the town was divided into factions, believers and disbelievers in Elizabeth's story, while Chitty himself had become a skeptic. Chitty's scant notes from January 31st, 1753 raised doubts, as he admitted to their inadequacy and confusion, compounded by his failure to produce the original notes or any paper submitted by Elizabeth. This lapse in documentation only adds to the enigma surrounding the case. These notes, lacking clarity regarding their timing and source, outline Elizabeth's account as follows. On January 1st, 1753, around 10 p.m., near Bedlam in Moorfields, two men stripped her of her garments, robbed her of 13 shillings and sixpence, and pushed her along Bishopsgate Street until she lost consciousness. She regained awareness near Enfield Wash and was taken to a house believed to be Mother Wells's, where she encountered several persons. Unfortunately, the nature of these individuals remains unspecified, a crucial detail for assessing the validity of her story. In the house, she was coerced to comply with their actions, forced upstairs, and threatened with harm if she attempted to leave. Though the door was merely bolted, she was confined with access only to bread, water from a pitcher, and the mince pie intended for her brother. Her escape on January 29th occurred through a broken window pane onto a small shed or boards. Notably, she did not mention Hay in the room, nor did she identify Mrs. Wells by name. Criticism against Elizabeth stemmed from discrepancies upon inspecting Wells's premises. There was no penthouse for escape, nor an old picture found. However, beneath a makeshift bed support, a wooden picture of a crown was discovered. Previously, Mrs. Wells had used this emblem as a sign for her disreputable establishment, though it had been removed during a political unrest in December 1745. While Hay was present in the searched room, there was no penthouse. This discrepancy stands as the most significant issue within the alderman's notes, casting doubt on the reliability of these cryptic documents. Nash, the butler to the Goldsmiths Company, offered testimony during the examination before Chitty on January 31, 1753. In May 1754, he reiterated Elizabeth's description of her imprisonment as a little square, darkish room with a few old pictures, a detail consistent with one old picture noted in the records. However, Nash had previously mentioned a few old pictures as early as March 1753. Notably, Elizabeth mentioned injuring her ear while escaping through a window, a wound observed as freshly cut and bleeding upon her return home. Nash's account gains credibility, as on February 1, 1753, during a public investigation of the alleged House of Captivity, he expressed disbelief upon finding the premises to be inconsistent with Elizabeth's description. Yet Nash himself later advocated for support towards Elizabeth and expressed encouragement to her master, Lyon, as evidenced by a letter dated February 10, 1753. Furthermore, Nash and two others, upon witnessing what they perceived as Elizabeth's perjury, during Mrs. Wells's trial, whom Elizabeth never mentioned to Chitty, failed to provide evidence against her, offering feeble excuses. Conversely, at the 1754 trial, neighbours recounted Elizabeth's narrative as she described it upon her return home, appearing distressed and barely conscious. Mrs. Myers, who had known Elizabeth for 11 years, attested to her character as a very sober, honest girl as any in England. According to Mrs. Myers, Elizabeth described encountering an elderly woman and two young ones upon her arrival at the house, where her stays were cut by the elder woman. She was then confined to a room with Hay, a pitcher of water, and pieces of bread. Interestingly, the provision of bread and water while she slept was never noted in trial proceedings. Additionally, Elizabeth recalled hearing the name Mother Wills or Wells mentioned during her captivity. Mrs. Woodward arrived in Mrs. Canning's room 15 minutes after Elizabeth's return, where Elizabeth recounted her ordeal of near starvation in a house along the Hertfordshire Road, identifiable by the passing Hertford coach. Describing the woman who cut her stays as tall, black and swarthy, Scarrett contested that she was not Mrs. Wells, a fair assertion. Elizabeth distinguished the two young women by their complexion, corroborated by Scarrett's testimony, supported further by Wintlebury and others. If the testimonies of Mrs. Myers, Mrs. Woodward, Scarrett, Wintlebury and others are reliable, Elizabeth's narrative rings true as she accurately identified the individuals, the location, and various details upon the visit to Mother Wells's house on February 1st. Nonetheless, it's imperative to acknowledge the bias inherent in accounts given 15 months after the events influenced by both sides. On February 1st, a multitude converged upon Mother Wells's residence, arriving in various modes of transportation. Nash, accompanied by Lyon, Aldridge, and Haig, encountered a throng of curious citizens and officers already present. The interior layout, however, contradicted Elizabeth's description, notably the presence of hay, which she had not mentioned before. Confusion persisted as differing accounts regarding the presence of hay emerged, with Mrs. Myers and Adamson offering conflicting perspectives on Elizabeth's description of the place. The skeptics contended that until Adamson returned to Elizabeth on her way to Wells's house, she had not mentioned the presence of hay. Their argument suggested that Adamson's inquiry, "Was there hay in the room?" prompted her affirmative response. By May 1754, Adamson and Mrs. Myers, both present in the cab with Elizabeth, recalled Adamson asking, "What kind of place is it?" and Elizabeth spontaneously mentioning the hay. However, it's crucial to note that during the trial of Mother Wells on February 21, 1754, Adamson provided the same testimony as he did in May 1754, indicating that Elizabeth described the room with hay without any prompting. Upon arrival at Mother Wells's, Elizabeth, feeling faint, was brought inside and placed on a dresser in the kitchen. It remains unclear why she did not immediately specify the location of her room upstairs beyond the door. Perhaps she was disoriented from her ordeal. Subsequently, she was escorted into the parlor where all the occupants of the house were gathered. Despite the chaos, Elizabeth immediately singled out a tall, elderly woman by the fire, smoking a pipe. According to Nash's skeptical testimony, she did so promptly and confidently. This woman, identified as Mary Squires, was described as tall, swarthy, and remarkably unattractive, marked with visible signs of disease. She claimed to have been in Dorset on January 1st, as attested by her son George, who was present. In 1754, 36 individuals testified to Mary Squires' presence in Dorset or encountering her on her journey to London, while 27 witnesses from Enfield swore to seeing her and her daughter near Mrs. Wells's establishment between December 18, 1752 and mid-January. Notably, some of the Enfield witnesses hailed from more affluent and educated backgrounds compared to those supporting the gypsies' account. Many witnesses from both sides were eager to testify, some even providing affidavits as early as March 1753. The phenomenon of cross-swearing remains utterly confounding. Both sides exhibited unwavering certainty in their assertions, yet the identity of the woman in question was unmistakable, as she rightly pointed out. The gypsy promptly presented her alibi. Her denial matched Elizabeth's accusation in promptness and conviction. However, if guilty, she had ample time since the girl's escape to craft her defense strategy. Elizabeth also identified Lucy Squires, the gypsy's daughter, and Virtue Hall as the two girls present when her stays were cut. Upon recognition, Elizabeth was guided through the house. According to Nash, in the loft above the kitchen, she confirmed, "This is the room, for here is the hay I lay upon, but I think there is more of it." She also identified the pitcher with the broken mouth, previously mentioned to Chitty, as the vessel that held her water ration. Although there was an attempt to suggest that someone from her group brought the pitcher to corroborate her account, this effort failed. Nevertheless, the fact that she mentioned the pitcher was acknowledged. Mrs. Myers, present in the loft, corroborated Elizabeth's description of additional hay, echoing Nash's account. She also noted Elizabeth's action of pushing aside the hay, revealing two holes, asserting they were present during her captivity. On February 7th, Elizabeth, under threat of prosecution if she continued to waver, swore to her narrative, formally documented by her solicitor, before Henry Fielding, the author of Tom Jones. Virtue Hall, after persistent prevarication, eventually corroborated Elizabeth's account under duress, but later recanted after being influenced by the opposing side. Mary Squires was tried at the Old Bailey from February 21, 26 and sentenced to death, with Virtue Hall corroborating Elizabeth's testimony. Mrs. Wells received a branding on her hand. However, 3 Dorset witnesses supporting Squires' alibi were not deemed credible, and Fortune and Judith Natus, despite being subpoenaed, did not appear in court, citing fear of the mob. Nash, Haig, and Aldridge, the 3 skeptics, remained silent. Dissatisfied with the outcome, Lord Mayor Sir Crispin Gascoigne secured numerous affidavits supporting the gypsy's alibi, while the opposing side gathered evidence of her presence at Enfield. Virtue Hall, swayed by Dr. Hill, ultimately recanted her testimony. George Squires, aided by an attorney, bolstered the evidence for the alibi, resulting in her receiving a pardon. Consequently, on April 29, 1754, the trial of Elizabeth Canning for willful and corrupt perjury commenced. Mr. Davy, representing the Crown, made a rather speculative suggestion, implying that Elizabeth absconded to preserve her character and fabricated a romantic story to solicit money. He went as far as insinuating that she was willing to accept money even at the cost of innocent blood, the gypsy's blood. These hypotheses, however, are preposterous. Elizabeth's character hardly required saving. Mr. Davy proceeded to highlight the glaring improbabilities within Elizabeth's narrative. Undeniably, the story presented numerous incredulous elements, but as Fielding aptly noted, so did the facts themselves. Someone had undoubtedly subjected Elizabeth to stripping, starvation, and imprisonment, bringing her perilously close to death. It's implausible to suggest that Elizabeth endured these ordeals merely to elicit sympathy. Such a notion is unfounded. Had she indulged in revelry on New Year's night, the outcome would likely have been far different, perhaps involving reckless indulgence rather than immediate starvation. The notion that an honest, quiet girl like Elizabeth could be so horrendously mistreated seemed highly improbable, yet the grossly improbable had undeniably transpired. The fact that Elizabeth managed to subsist for a month on a loaf of bread didn't surprise Mrs. Canning. She recalled instances when Elizabeth, faced with dire circumstances, survived on just half a roll a day. This detail, along with the story of the farthing, reinforces my support for Elizabeth's cause. Contrary to Mr. Davy's assertion, Elizabeth never claimed certainty regarding Mrs. Wells, neither during her testimony before Chitty nor at any other time. She neither knew nor pretended to know anything about Mrs. Wells. Her recognition was limited to a tall, swarthy woman, a dark girl, and a fair girl, whom she identified as the gypsy, her daughter, and Virtue Hall. Mr. Davy favored Nash's testimony over that of the neighbors and even Chitty's notes when discrepancies arose between Nash and Chitty. Additionally, Mr. Davy erroneously claimed that Nash withdrew his assistance after the visit to the house, whereas evidence such as his letter dated February 10th indicated otherwise. Nash's assistance, akin to that of Mr. Tracy Tupman, primarily involved encouraging others to contribute financially. Certain assertions regarding the timing of Elizabeth finishing the water became contentious, and Chitty's notes regarding the penthouse were heavily scrutinized. A particularly egregious claim was made by Mr. Wills, later Solicitor General, alleging that Adamson brought the broken pitcher into the house. However, for 3 months prior to February 1st, Adamson had not encountered Elizabeth Canning nor heard her description of the room. George Squires was then examined. While he had been extensively coached regarding his activities after December 29th, he couldn't recall his whereabouts on Christmas Day, merely 4 days earlier. Despite Mr. Davy's accusation of inebriation due to conflicting accounts of time, George maintained that he kissed Lucy Squires at a time when she couldn't have been present to corroborate his claim. Additionally, as confessed by Mr. Davy, the prosecuting counsel, the Squires family had connections with the smuggling trade, being described as gypsies dealing in smuggled goods. Furthermore, while George Squires had been coached extensively, the prosecution avoided calling his sister Lucy as a witness, alleging that she was much more dull than George. In his closing statement, Mr. Davy reiterated the old argument. Elizabeth had disappeared to conceal a misfortune, with her cunning mother as an accomplice. He argued that while there was no evidence of Elizabeth's unchastity, there comes a point when people turn to wickedness. The recorder's summation leaned against Elizabeth, consistently siding with Nash and dismissing the Enfield witnesses' testimonies. Furthermore, he posited that if the Enfield witnesses were truthful, then the Dorset witnesses must have committed perjury knowingly. However, he failed to acknowledge the possibility that if the Dorset witnesses were accurate, then the Enfield witnesses would be the ones committing perjury. The jury returned a verdict of guilty of perjury but not willful and corrupt. This was technically an acquittal, but the recorder rejected it. Consequently, the jury adhered to the court's directive and a sentence was issued. 2 jurors later swore affidavits claiming they had never intended for a conviction. The pivotal issue for the jury revolved around a discrepancy regarding when Elizabeth finished the water in the broken pitcher, either on Wednesday, January 27th, or on Friday, January 29th. As both accounts couldn't be true, the jury deemed it perjury, though not willful and corrupt. Feeling pressured by the court's impatience, the jury initially found Elizabeth guilty of perjury, later escalating it to corrupt and willful perjury, while concurrently urging mercy in their verdict. As to Elizabeth's later fortunes, accounts differ, but after transportation to America, she quite certainly married in Connecticut a Mr. Treat, a respectable yeoman, said to have been opulent. She died in Connecticut in June 1773.